Here we go. Okay, so I wanted to introduce myself in this class this evening. We are doing stormwater detention awareness for Brier residents, and we are featuring this evening Derek Hann. He is our one of our design engineers or district engineers, and he will be talking about the stormwater. That's sort of where his head goes all the time. So it's very cool. And then I am Kari Kwas. I am your host this evening. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can use Q&A, and I will pass those along to Derek. He's happy to answer them along the way. We also, and there's that, we are recording it so we can watch this later. If you have any technical questions, feel free to put those in the chat too. Also, just a little bit about what a conservation district. So this class tonight is partially sponsored by the City of Brier, and then featuring the people from Snohomish Conservation District. So we are a special district of the state. We do kind of conservation work in that we practice, and we do free technical assistance. We have education, and our goal is to protect natural resources. So land, air, soil, water quality, things like that. And we do that through a variety of means. We have a team that goes out and does habitat work. We have the team that Derek's mainly on, which is community conservation, so working in your urban centers. We also have a bunch of agricultural folks, so resource planners that work with farms and small land owners. We also have a new forester on staff. So we're kind of in several different realms. We also work with a lot of municipalities like the City of Brier. And so we're happy to be here tonight to be supporting their work as they educate their residents about stormwater. So with me this evening is Jennifer Flathman, and I will give her a moment to talk about City of Brier and what their expectations are. She's their city planner, and her contact information is there. Afterwards, I'll be sending out this presentation, so you'll be able to go back and find this stuff too. So Jennifer, what would you like to share this evening?
I'd like to thank everybody for attending this class and wanting to find out more about stormwater on a beautiful, very dry evening at the end of a dry, or towards the end of a very dry summer. Also wanted to thank Kari and Derek for helping with this class, and the Conservation District. They've been helping the City of Brier with our stormwater and other responsibilities for quite a while, and doing a really great job. They do classes with the schools, and they help us with just a variety of things that we really appreciate. So the goal of this class is to help residents better understand that their responsibilities in terms of maintaining the stormwater systems that are either on or serving their properties. Derek is going to, give you a lot of really good technical information down the road. If there's specific questions you have about your property, you can contact either me or Steve Smith, the Public Works Supervisor, to get more detailed information about your specific property and the systems that work there for you. So with that, I'm really looking forward to this class. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, so much. All right, and then without further ado, Derek Hann, again, he's one of our district engineers. He's been at the district over 10 years, Derek, is that right?
11 years, yes.
11 years,
That is over 10, yeah.
Over 10. So he really is kind of the front runner and the groundbreaker literally for a lot of rain gardens and a lot of systems that have gone into cities and, trying different things over time. So he's been studying this for some time and working hands-on in it. And so at this point, I'll stop sharing and pass this over to Derek.
Thank you. I think I want to do this. Is that showing up okay?
It is starting to show up. There we go. Yeah.
All right.
We'll go off video and then I'll pass questions to you as they come up.
Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, again, my name is Derek Hann. I'm a civil engineer. I've been with the district for 11 years. Before that, I was 4 years in the private industry. That's where most of my initial encounters with detention facilities came into play. So I'm just going to go through some basics tonight, tell you how these systems function, what maintenance looks like, and then what you guys are obligated to do in terms of maintenance and inspection and that type of thing. Please feel free to put questions in the chat and I can just answer them as we go. That's usually the best way to work for me. Without too much more, let's just get started. So, oops. First, so what is the reason that we even do detention ponds and detention faults? And it's because we have a bit of a stormwater problem in this area. Basically, 100 years ago, especially in Brier, everywhere looked like this. It was very complex, vegetated ground cover and lots of water bodies all over the place. And so when water falls out of the sky, there's a lot of things that happen with it. Almost 50% of the water goes straight back up into the sky. And that's called evapotranspiration. So basically what happens is the water falls down and hits a leaf, and then that drips off and hits another leaf, and that drips off and hits another leaf. And every time it hits a leaf, a little bit of it evaporates back up into the atmosphere. And then it hits the ground, and then the heat of the ground puts that back up. And then the plants themselves actually, as part of their respiratory system, breathe a lot of water back up in the atmosphere too. So, so right off the bat, 50% of the water doesn't even really reach the ground. And then once it does reach the ground, 35% of the water soaks into the soil. So some of it just stays on the surface, some of it soaks down deep into the aquifer, and very little of the water actually runs off into what will be a creek or a river or a lake or a Puget Sound. And so what's happened though is that we've come in and developed, and we've replaced these what are called pervious areas. Pervious just means water soaks into it, with impervious areas. So roofs and driveways and parking lots and roads, gravel areas. Pretty much most modern development is a hard surface of some kind. And so one, it almost completely eliminates any evaporation and transpiration mechanism. So only about 10% of the water, well, this is 15 to 30. I think it's actually a lot less than that, but goes back up in the atmosphere after it hits a hard surface. Very little of it actually goes into the ground at all. And as we get rid of more and more landscaped areas, because we're putting down denser and denser development, less and less water gets into the soil and more of it runs off. So almost all the water runs off, and this creates all kinds of issues to the downstream. So one of the biggest issues is flooding. I like to explain this as people getting on as traffic. So if everybody's trying to get onto I-5 at the same time, everything backs up. It works the same way with rivers. If all the water is trying to go to the river at the same time, everything backs up. One of the downsides of hard surfaces that we put in is that water moves very, very quickly over the top of it. When a raindrop falls out of the sky in a forest, sometimes it will take days before it will get to the nearest waterway. And in urban developments, it will only take about 6 to 10 minutes to get to the nearest waterway. It just moves very, very quickly. And because of that, everything can back up. We get soil erosion. Because that water starts moving so fast, it picks up particles of soil that it would not normally pick up and moves them downstream. So not only do we end up with deeper rivers and streams and slopes starting to fail and things falling into the water because the soil is moving, but we actually get sediment deposits on the downstream. So the Puget Sound ends up filling with a lot more sediment than it normally have. We get a lot of pollution. So things like trash and hydrocarbons from cars and brake dusts and heavy metals all get caught up in that stormwater, and then they just go to the nearest drain and go to the nearest waterway. A lot of people tend to think that stormwater is treated the same way that sewage is treated, and that's not the case. Most stormwater just goes straight to the nearest creek or stream and then goes right out into Puget Sound. And actually the #1 source of pollution to Puget Sound by a significant margin is stormwater. And then we end up with less groundwater because we're not infiltrating water. It's not going into the aquifer at all. So we end up actually mining water, and because we're pulling it out faster from our wells than we are putting it back. So those are the problems that we're trying to solve. And that's why we have the stormwater systems around this area. So this is a standard. This is just what we would call a catch basin. I'm sure you've all seen these around. This is where stormwater goes. And this is what a catch basin looks when it's out of the ground. It's just a big concrete box. And every one of those cutouts is a place where you would punch a hole for a pipe. And one catch basin leads to another catch basin, which leads to another catch basin. all the way down the chain until it outlets to usually a creek or a stream in the local area. So in order to combat that, they started doing this a little bit in the 50s, and it grew to much wider adoption in the 80s and early 90s. And the idea is that you dig a big hole and you let the water fill it up, and then you release it at a really slow rate. And that rate of release is supposed to mimic what a forest would release that water at. So there's a bunch of in-depth modeling that goes into this, but basically you size these detention facilities to be able to hold as much water as second growth forest would. And so that's why these facilities exist. It's just basically a big volume storage area with a specially designed hole and an outlet structure that releases water at a certain rate. Alternative to that is bioretention. That's something that we're moving more towards in this area. That's something that I specialize in. So this is just kind of a little plug for us in our program. And this is another way of solving this problem, which is much closer to mimicking what happens in an actual forest. We're basically building an artificial forest on someone's property, or taking stormwater from local development, and you just dig a hole in the ground, you backfill it with a special type of soil, and you send water to it. And instead of then tying to a catch basin, which ties the nearest creek, the idea is that most of the water actually infiltrates back into the soil like it would have 100 years ago. And so that's the direction in general most new developments going, but we still have to deal with all these detention systems that we put in and are continuing to put in this current model for development that we have around here. In addition to detention systems, there's almost always some type of treatment to the water going to the system. So the most common type is called a cartridge filter system. We're going to go more into depth in this, but basically this is to remove pollution before it goes into the nearest creek or waterway. And it's just a giant Brita filter for the most part. It removes hydrocarbons and heavy metals and nutrients that would do damage to the downstream. Sometimes you will hear people talk about detention versus retention. There is a difference between those two. We don't, especially in Snohomish County, we don't do retention very often, but it does come up every once in a while. The difference is a retention pond is allowed to infiltrate. So it does do some soil recharge in terms of soaking water back into the soil, and detention is just pure volume storage. But yeah, like I said, it doesn't work very well in a lot of Snohomish County because we have dense soils, and sometimes infiltration can be a bit of a challenge. So most of our systems are just pure detention, where you're storing a volume of water and then releasing it at a certain rate. Every detention pond has certain elements that need to be inspected and maintained and that you need to be aware of. So they all have some kind of access ramp for vehicle access to get down. That usually includes a gate on the fence that's around it. They have an inlet for the water to be collected and then go into the detention facility, and then an outlet for the water to come out of the detention facility. Usually those are on opposite ends of the facility because we want the water to pass all the way through the pond because it gives it some settling and some water quality, some pollution removal benefit if it goes all the way through the pond. There's a pond bottom. Sometimes the pond bottom is wet and sometimes it's dry. We'll get into that a little bit more later. There's an emergency spillway in case the outlet plugs up. We need a safe direction for that water to flow so it just doesn't back up and flood the houses that are nearby. And then oftentimes there are berms, big mounds of dirt that kind of divide the pond up into cells or direct water where to go. And all of these things need to be looked at when they are inspected to make sure that they're functioning correctly. I'm going to go through some of the common elements. So there are things that you're going to be seeing. Let me back up a second. One of the most important things that you guys are going to need, if you don't already have it, is the stormwater plans for your development. If you're part of an HOA, or even if you have a single family residence, but you have some type of detention facility, you need to go to the city and find your original plans that show how everything operates and everything functions. If you don't have those plans, I highly recommend it. You can go to the city will help you find those. It's really difficult to maintain these systems without having those documents. And there's actually two documents that you need to have. One is the plan set that, so it comes on big sheets and the drawings of how everything works, where everything goes, all the details. And then the other thing you need is there's actually something called a drainage report, which is basically a long form essay, technical essay that explains the design process. And that's in some ways is actually more important than the plan set for you to have, because in the back of that is the maintenance manual that will tell you step by step what you are obligated to do in terms of maintenance. And that's a very important document that I actually find most people don't have. So even HOAs that do have plan sets that shows everything, they don't have the drainage report, which has the maintenance manual in it. So that's both of those documents really need to be gotten from the city. And like I said, the city can help you figure out where those are. So if you're taking notes, I definitely recommend you take a note to find those two documents if you don't have them. So some of the things that you'll see in your detention ponds and on the plans are different types of catch basins. There's typically two types. Type 1 are smaller catch basins, as you see on the left here, and they're usually just big cubes, concrete cubes, and they have kind of that square grate on the top. There is also type 2 catch basins, and this is more like a manhole, and these are much larger. They can hold really large diameter pipes, sometimes up to 6-8 feet in diameter. They're much deeper, and they usually have a round manhole lid on the top. And those need to be maintained differently because the type 2 catch basins are so significantly deeper than the type 1s. You usually need more technical expertise to clean out type 2s. And these do need to get cleaned out because they get full of sediment and need to be checked to make sure they're not leaking and that the pipes are tight. There's also a control structure. We're going to get a little bit more into this later, but it can be a fairly complicated structure. And this is usually on the downstream end of your pond or your vault. And basically, it's a very specifically designed structure that releases water at a very specific rate. That also, of all the things to maintain on your detention pond, this is one of the most important ones to keep in mind, because if this gets plugged up or is not functioning correctly, that can cause significant flooding to the downstream, and that needs to be addressed. Fencing and security. Most of the ponds that you see out there have some type of fence around them. This is a liability issue. One thing I would mention is not everybody likes the look of the fences. I have been to a couple of sites where the fences are not technically required because the side slopes of the pond are not quite steep enough. They just put them up because that was what was needed. So that may be something to address if you wanted to remove the fence, because some people do have aesthetic problems with ponds, but that is a bit of a more complicated issue. So I'd recommend you talk to me in the city. Don't just go out and take a fence down. But it's something that's worth looking at or thinking about. Fence is required. Basically, it's if the side slopes are steeper than a 3-to-1, which most ponds around our areas are, and it's usually put up for liability. One of the drawbacks is it doesn't look very good, and it does tend to discourage maintenance. So things tend to get overgrown faster if you have a fence. So it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing. In addition to detention ponds, there are detention vaults, and these are just great big underground structures. Some of them are very, very large. I've seen ones that are large enough to park a 747 in, and it works under the same idea as a pond. It's just a really large volume that fills slowly with stormwater and then is released at an even slower rate. The downside of a detention vault is because it is buried, HOAs are much less likely to know that they have one, and they require the same amount, if not more tricky at times, maintenance as a detention pond. So if you're not entirely sure if you do have any detention facilities on your property, make sure that that a detention vault is not something that you have. And again, you need the plan set and the drainage report in order to determine if that is something that you will be looking at. Here's an example of some of these vaults that are put in. Like I said, they're very, very large facilities sometimes. Large enough typically that you can get a bobcat into the bottom of them. And that's in fact how they're maintained sometimes, is you just drive a bobcat around the interior when it's drained and scrape out any sediment that might be in the bottom. Most of the ponds are planted with some types of plants. Grasses, trees, and shrubs are usually what's recommended. It is important that you try and keep these facilities from being overcome with invasive species, things like blackberry and Scotch broom and that type of thing. Plant maintenance does end up being a fairly significant portion of pond maintenance, making sure these things don't get too overgrown. Common issues are things like cattails growing in this, which isn't native. It's not invasive, but the problem with cattails is that when they bloom, they put off this fuzz, and that can go in and plug up some of the orifices in the control structure. So this can involve a bit of maintenance. Usually it just involves some type of mowing and then getting in there and pulling or cutting down plants that are too large. One of the other issues is if you get trees in there that are too big, they start eating up storage volume because they grow, and so your pond stops being the correct size that it is. So it is important to get there every once in a while and take out trees and shrubs that have gotten too big. So I had mentioned earlier the treatment cartridge filter. Like I said, these are just great big Brita filters. They're these big black cartridges that are filled with a special type of media that's been very heavily engineered to remove things like heavy metals and pollutants and hydrocarbons and nutrients. The downside of this is that, like a Brita filter, these things do get plugged over time. And so actually these filters are supposed to be, you guys are actually obligated under the maintenance requirements to change these every 3 to 5 years. And that can be a bit of a cost to the HOA. So that's something that if you have not discussed with your HOA, something that does need to be addressed and needed to be planned for. And if it has been a number of years since these have been changed, you're probably obligated to go in there and make sure and change them out. And it usually does require some type of professional to come in, and they use a special type of crane because these things are very heavy to lift these out and replace them. And again, you will find out if you have this type of media filter system if you look at your plans. And that drainage report will have a section in the back that explains your obligation for how often these need to be changed. Another way of treating the water is what's called a bioswale. So this is basically what we talked about earlier with the bioretention facility or the rain garden. So it moves water kind of like a little stream, and a special type of soil is put in there. And as the water moves through the soil, it's cleaned and things are filtered out of it. And then usually before or after it enters the detention pond. There are other types of treatments out there. This is called a Filtera system, where they actually have a tree that does a lot of the work. That's the thing on the left. The thing on the right is a contact vortex system that's designed to remove sediment out of things. So these are all things that, again, will be on your plan. And all of these things do need to be maintained, typically by a professional at some point. And that is something that you're obligated to do. So get those plans, look at what's on there. If you do have questions about what you do have, feel free to reach out to myself or the city, and we can help you kind of figure out what's on there. But most of this inspection work is actually going to be done by private inspectors that you guys hire. That's an important thing about the City of Brier, is that the city itself does not do inspections to your stormwater facility. That's something your HOA or whatever body you're part of is responsible for, is hiring a private inspector. But you are obligated legally to do those inspections and to communicate that with the city. So again, because we do treatments and then we have detention. And there's usually two ways of doing this. One is called an upstream treatment chain and one is called a downstream treatment chain. And an upstream treatment chain, the treatment comes first and then the water goes into the pond. And then in the downstream one, it's the opposite of that. The water goes into the pond first and then into the treatment. And this is only important because you need to know that you have treatment and where it could be located. And the people that are going to do the maintenance will have slightly different requirements for the upstream treatment chain versus the downstream treatment chain. Well, before we move on, are there any questions? I know this is a pretty dense topic, so I want to take a minute to see if we have any questions or people that are confused before we get into the more technical side of what maintenance actually requires. Give you guys a minute.
None are in there right now, Derek, but yeah, again, feel free to ask at any time. I can interrupt him and ask your question for you.
Cool, thank you.
Hey,
All right.
Derek, this
Yeah.
is Jennifer. I just wanted to jump in that one other type of detention structure or facility that we have around Brier are just detention pipes.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I'll cover that. So
Okay, great.
I don't have a picture of that, but thank you for the reminder. So yeah, another way of doing detention is basically you have a really large diameter pipe between two catch basins. It works the same as a vault, except instead of a big cube, it's a big cylinder. And those do have their own little bit slightly unique maintenance requirements as well. Usually they need to have the sediment sucked out of them in a special way that's a little bit more tricky than a detention vault, just because the access is a little bit more difficult. So if you don't have a vault, there's a good chance that you don't have a pond, there is a good chance that you might have a pipe instead. And that's also something that you're obligated to maintain. We'll get a little bit into what you're legally obligated to do. First thing you need to figure out is what in fact you own. This will be a little bit different depending on the structure of things like HOAs or local cooperatives. Sometimes, most of the time, these systems are going to be located on private property. There are probably a couple of locations in the city where it's located on city property or it's located on private property, but the city's obligated to take care of them. But most of these cases, they are located on property that's owned by the HOA, and the HOA is responsible for it. Figuring out what condition it is in really important. It's not uncommon for HOAs to be kind of surprised that they have these facilities and start to realize that they haven't been maintained in a long time. And if they haven't been maintained in a long time, the obligation to maintain them gets higher. And there will be more legal pressure on you to get in there and bring it back to a code that it's at. I'll get into maintenance costs in a little bit, but generally it's the same as maintaining everything. If you stay on top of maintenance early and you keep on it, it's going to be much cheaper in the long run than if you ignore it for a number of years and then come back and have to do it all of a sudden. I have consulted with a number of HOAs that kind of got surprised that they had to maintain it and then had to go back and do it. And it was quite expensive for a number of them, much more expensive than if they had just started from the beginning and maintained it yearly. We'll have to know what jurisdiction you're in. I'm assuming all of you are from the City of Brier, but if you're not, there might be slightly different requirements for you based on if you're in a different city or in an unincorporated county. You do have to keep records of when it was maintained. And then there also may be slightly different agreements with different jurisdictions and entities. Again, there's a possibility that the city will maintain the facility for you, or even maybe part of the facility, or part of the right of way next to the facility, or where it outlets to. So it really requires a good relationship with your local jurisdiction, and you going in and asking those questions and figuring out who's responsible for what legally, and getting clear understandings and understanding what the obligations are.
I'm going to jump in again just for a second. The City of Brier, for the more recent ponds where we're required to, that were permitted within since about 2009, we're required to provide DOE, Department of Ecology, with information that they were inspected. So you'll get a special letter from us telling you you need to do those inspections annually. If you have one of the older systems, you're still responsible for doing the maintenance and doing the inspections, but we're not going to be reaching out to you as frequently to get those reports.
Thank you. So this is usually the most common question is, what do I need a contractor for? And most of these systems at some point do need you to bring in a professional contractor. Some of these things can be maintained by the local residents, but there usually is at least one or two areas that you need to hire someone for. The biggest one is a confined space work. So we had talked about those control structures and those catch basins. Those can be significantly dangerous areas to work in. Gases will build up in the bottom of those, and it's very important that you don't ever get inside of one of those large catch basins to try and clean it out. It needs to be done by a professional that has all the training and gear to get down into those spaces and do the work. So that's usually the biggest thing that you need to hire out for. If there are really significant levels of vegetation in the garden, or if the side slopes, sorry, not the garden, the pond, or if the side slopes of the pond are really steep, it might be a good idea to hire a contractor to do that work, because again, they will have the equipment to do that instead of just a typical homeowner trying to figure it out. Deep water, some of these systems can be significantly deep, 10, 15 feet deep, I've seen. And that's something that you need to be aware of. And you may need to hire somebody to do that. If at any point heavy equipment is needed, like an excavator or backhoe, to go in there, like a bobcat in the vaults. Sometimes they have these big openings in the detention vaults, and you'll lower a bobcat in and use it to clean up the sediment. That usually needs to be hired out. And then vectoring is, a vector truck is just a giant vacuum that's loaded on a truck, and it's designed to suck sediment out of things. Oftentimes catch basins or the inlets and outlets of the structure need to be sucked out, and a vector truck is needed in order to do that. And that's another thing that you may have to hire out for. If you want to get into kind of the nitpicky detail of what you are obligated to do legally and the thinking behind it and some of the engineering, there are a couple places you can go. The big one is a Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington. That is produced by the Department of Ecology. And it's a pretty dense, thick manual, so it takes a lot of reading, but all of the requirements that you are obligated to are listed in that manual. And then on top of that, there is also, well, again, if you're in the City of Brier, it will be local municipal code that will dictate what you do and do not have to do. But most of that is actually a function of Department of Ecology's rules. But there can be some variation from city to city on how some of these things are obligated and what you were required to do. For vegetation, usually trimming and mowing is the big thing, just getting in there and making sure these things don't get too overgrown, removing invasives, and then figuring out what to do after you trim and mow with all the green waste. There can be significant levels of debris, plant debris and leaves and that type of thing. So you need to get in there and clean those out so that they don't plug the system up. We're going to get a little bit more into control structure. So this is basically a great big manhole that's located on the downstream end of every pond or vault. And in it, actually, is my mouse showing up okay? Can you see it?
Oh, yes, I can see it.
Okay. So in it is this thing here, which is just a vertically oriented pipe that usually has a number of downturned elbows, or it has a weir in it. And those elbows are what control the rate of flow out of this system. And those need to be maintained regularly because they can plug with debris, and they do need to be inspected regularly. And so that's going to be a significant part of the private inspection that you pay for, is them going inside of this control structure and making sure everything's clear, nothing's plugged up, everything's working like it's supposed to be. One of the more common issues that I see with control structures is there's this, it's hard to see, but there's this line here, and then this kind of half circle here, and that is an emergency overflow gate. And basically that's there for if the pond needs to be drained quickly in an emergency, you basically pull on a chain or a lever and you can drain the whole pond. Very commonly, someone has come in and pulled that open and left it open. They usually either prop it open or zip tie it to a ladder rung. And that's a pretty significant problem because it means the pond will not be performing as designed. If you are around the control structures and you're looking at them, that's one of the things that I usually recommend people look for first, is making sure that that emergency gate valve is closed, so that the pond is not draining faster than it needs to be. And again, this will require a confined space in order to get here inside of this detention or inside of this control structure. You need certification to go inside confined spaces, because there are gases that'll build up in here they can kill you if you are down there messing around and you don't have the right equipment. Trash and debris removal is another thing that needs to happen. Usually, coffee cups and garbage and basketballs and that type of thing end up in these ponds inevitably, and that needs to go in there and be removed so that everything flows well. It is over time, if it's been a long time since the system's been maintained, it'll just fill with sediment. So, dirt from the upstream and plant debris and that type of thing will start to fill it up, and that will reduce the volume of the facility. And that needs, at some point, we'll need to get somebody to get in there and remove that for you. And then another thing you need to look out for is erosion, making sure that the side slopes of these facilities are not collapsing due to the rushing water. So what does a failed system look like? The most common one is flooding. So all of a sudden the pond is much fuller than it used to be. It doesn't seem to be draining well. It's causing backstream issues. All of a sudden pipes are full of water that didn't used to be full of water. So that's something they definitely want to look out for. Pollution. So if these things have an oil slick over the top, or they're just full of garbage, that's another system or another way that these things will fail. Over vegetation, we've talked about a couple of times, just too much vegetation down inside of it. Filling with sediment, we just talked about. Slope failure, that's usually erosion or some type of thing that's caused the slope to move or crack in a special way. Short circuiting means a lot of these systems are designed to kind of flow in almost a labyrinth or a maze. So they use berms to kind of get the water to flow back and forth and up and down. And short circuiting means that some of those berms have been broken and water is basically entering the system and exiting the system right away instead of making its way through. And then another significant issue would be if it never ponds. If you never ever see water in this, even during a really intense rainstorm, that's usually a problem and not a good sign. So that's what a failed system usually looks like. Like we mentioned, you are probably going to need to hire a contractor at some point. That's really important that you hire somebody that's licensed and insured. Previous experience is really, really important. It is common sometimes for people to just say that they've done this stuff or say, oh yeah, I can kind of figure it out as I go. And I have had a number of homeowners that have run into problems hiring people that didn't really know what they're doing, ended up doing damage to the facility. So ask some good questions. Make sure you get a number of bids when you're going out. Get at least 3 bids when you're doing this process. Get references, and then make sure that you get cost estimates from the contractors and that you budget appropriately every year to go in and do this maintenance. Inspection and reporting. You do need to maintain a regular schedule. you should stay in contact with the city on this. Like I said, you're obligated. The city lets you know via that letter that you're obligated to have these inspected every year. And so keeping on top of that is important. It's really important that you have somebody in your HOA or other organization documenting the stuff that comes in. You need to document when it was cleaned. You need to document inspection. Anything that looks odd, I highly recommend you take pictures of. And like I mentioned earlier, it's really, really important that you get those existing plans and that existing drainage report and have those on file that you can reference as you're working on these facilities. So budgeting is usually one of the biggest things that comes up. I didn't really get into wet ponds versus dry ponds yet, but basically a wet pond is a facility that stays wet on the bottom all the time. I'd say probably 40% of the detention ponds that are designed are wet ponds, and then 60% of them are dry, where they will dry out in the summer or when it's not raining. Wet ponds are a bit more expensive to maintain than dry ponds in general, but wet ponds do provide a water quality benefit. So sometimes if you have a wet pond, they don't have upstream cartridge filter systems or anything like that. So that can save you money in the long run. If you do the routine maintenance, you do it every year. You're usually looking at between, I'd say probably $200 is probably in the very low end. So $600 to $1,000 a year that you need to budget for to get people in and just do the inspection, take care of everything, make sure everything is good. Non-routine maintenance. So if it has been a long time since this thing has been cleaned out, it can cost quite a bit. I have $4,000 listed here. I have had HOAs spend as much as $30,000 trying to bring a system back online that's failed significantly because it hadn't been maintained, and that was quite a sticker shock for a lot of those homeowners. So again, if you stay on top of the maintenance early, it will save you money in the long run. I think we're gonna send out this presentation. So here's a couple of links. This is probably not the best way to do it, but if you do have more questions on budgeting, here's a couple of links that will help you figure that out.
Yeah, Derek, I'll be sending out the recording of the presentation, and I can send separately the links and your contact information as well as Jennifer's.
Thank you.
Yep.
So yeah, and I highly recommend that you maintain a good relationship with the city as you're doing this. They're a great resource. While they can't do the inspections for you, they can help you answer questions. They can, tell you about the code, what you're obligated to do. They can also help you with resources. Also, feel free to reach out to us at the Conservation District if you have other questions. Both of us are here to help. It's best if you keep a cordial relationship because you really don't want things on this to be litigious. I've seen a number of homeowners go down that path, and it doesn't usually end very well. So use the resources of the city early, and use them to help educate yourself on what you're obligated to do. Resources that you need in order to get this done. City records are going to be really important to you. GIS is going to be really helpful. A lot of these systems are going to be in some version of the local GIS. Snohomish County has a really nice updated PDS mapping tool that should have a lot of this drainage information in it. The drainage report and plans, again, we've talked about it a number of times. I also mentioned the stormwater manual if you really want to kind of get into the nitpicky details of it. Making sure that you have your maintenance agreements on hand. Some of those are related with the title sometimes, so making sure that you've familiarized yourself with that. Google Maps can be really helpful, and then again, feel free to reach out to the Conservation District. We can help you. All right, I know that was a lot of information. It's pretty densely packed. This is a fairly nuanced topic. Hopefully, at the very least, you've come away with this with understanding that this is a fairly complicated issue. that you are obligated to do. You have a legal obligation to educate yourself on. And it's not something that you want to put off for a long time because it will catch up with you eventually. So I recommend that you reach out, use the resources available, work with the city, and ask more questions if you're still confused about things. And hopefully this is enough of an intro to kind of get you started. So does anybody else have any questions before we move on?
Not seeing any yet, but also if I think you can raise your hand and I can allow you to talk, because sometimes I know it's really hard to type a difficult question. So if that's of interest, feel free to raise your hand.
Jennifer, did you have anything to add?
No, I think you did a great job covering it. Like Derek said, this is an introduction and there are a lot of resources to help you as you go forward with this process. So we definitely are glad that you all came and took the time to, you know, get educated on this.
Yeah, I'm still not seeing any questions, but feel free. I'll be sending out an email probably on Monday with this recording and the contact information. And so then everyone can reach out to us, or if they have more questions, they can watch it again too. So thank you very much, Derek. Thanks, Jennifer, for having us. And then we'll continue this conversation because it sounds like from Derek, you got to keep up on this stuff.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, do it early.
Do it early. Yeah, there you go.
Do it now. Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, I will stop the recording. Everyone have a lovely evening and the good rest of your summer. Thanks so much.
Thank you.